Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So I get the lucky postprandial dip slot, but hopefully can move a little bit quickly, throw some new ideas and insights at you, and keep you alive and on your toes. So just the title, I didn't really choose, but it's sort of fun. Apparently, some of you have not seen The Matrix. I would recommend it, although I would agree that Keanu is not the world's greatest actor. Sorry, but yeah. That's okay. It's still a cool movie. So my name is Ahrash Bissell. I am the president at a nonprofit called NROC, or the NROC Project. Some of you may know us as the Monterey Institute for Technology and Education, but we just don't use that name anymore. It's too long, and everybody knows this is NROC. We're a 15-year organization that works generally in college and career readiness and kind of the intersection of open education and digital resources and so on. So I'll go into that in a little bit. But my background, I have a doctorate in evolutionary biology and took an interest in teaching and technology early on and got involved in a lot of different things along the way and eventually launched the education program at Creative Commons and sort of built up a lot of the legal and technical infrastructure for OER. And then I moved on from there and actually joined this organization in large part because I really wanted to build solutions to things. That was kind of my driving interest. And so I'll go into some of what we've done in that vein. I've known some people here for a long time and have also been interested in this intersection of math and biology. And I was part of the group that led to the grant that brought you all here. So it's really exciting to see it growing. Anyway, that's cool. So what do we do at NROC? I'll give you a little background. This is our mission statement. So it's pretty broad. We're just sort of like, hey, we feel like maybe an organization that pays attention to the fact that stuff's changing all the time and there are new tools and affordances, and frankly, it's really super overwhelming. Is there some way that we can serve as kind of a guide in that? Can we build solutions that people might actually use? We do that with a particular emphasis on college and career readiness. So I will give you some of this background. Some of it came up already around issues, things like cut scores and developmental math and so on. I'm going to touch on that, but I'm not going to dwell on that. I am more than happy to talk to any of you about any of that at any length. I'll be here for the rest of the time, so feel free to track me down. As I said, we're a nonprofit. We are a community-guided project. And so really the secret sauce of our work is the fact that much like you all are sort of the beginning point of what we're imagining will continue to be a growing community, our work really wouldn't happen if we didn't have engaged educators both in secondary and post-secondary, also adult ed, workforce development, et cetera, who are willing to actually sit down and think differently about what we're doing when we're talking about student preparedness, student retention, success towards what, et cetera, and the policies and procedures we have around that. And we work together to try to define what are the kinds of tools, open educational resources, learning platforms, et cetera, that could help make all of this easier. One of the challenges, of course, is, I think this is much of what you're going to be grappling with, and this is very much in the heart of what we do, that there's part of us that always wishes you could just find the object that you need. Like, it's just a fitting exercise, like, oh, I know what I need, and if it just existed, I'd just plug it in and we'd be good. And that's pretty much just a fiction, right? There's always going to be some modification that's required, and so there's always going to have to be some level of engagement that's required. And the question is, how much can you tolerate? Are you being given room to do that? And that's no different in our work. It's very much part and parcel of what you all are building. You're not going to build the world's best OER module that everyone's just going to use. That's not the goal, right? The goal is to give something that feels sufficiently well-formed and effective that somebody else is willing to take it to the next step. We find that just philosophically, that's a huge leap for a lot of people. Like that whole idea of, wait a minute, I'm not just like deciding which cereal I want. No, you're kind of making the cereal. Like, that's what we're doing here. Yeah. And that's just not how our society is set up. We do a lot of things within this. So in product development, community adoption, we do a lot of support around implementation and refinement. We have to maintain all of this, and then we have partnerships with a lot of organizations, including many organizations that are involved here. Just dwell a little bit, my special project, the one I spend most of the time on, is called EdReady. EdReady is a platform for personalized learning. We built it explicitly because we saw the emergent landscape around adaptive and personalized learning tools, and they were all, in our words, not OER friendly. They depended very much on a design that did not allow you to go in and drop in the learning resources you want or assess people in the ways that you prefer. They would break if you did that. And moreover, the sort of secret sauce of adaptivity was really what was, in the black box. That's what the companies were building themselves around. And so we just asked the question, well, where's the OER platform for this? And we didn't see it, so we built it. Fortunately, we got money to do that, starting with the Hewlett Foundation, also from the Gates Foundation, Irvine, and others. EdReady is being used by some people here. And again, I would encourage anyone who's interested in all of this to come talk to me. Some of what I'm going to dive into uses EdReady as a model. So like what EdReady can do can help guide some of the considerations you might have as you're developing these modules and thinking about how do we build them so that they are more adaptable? How do we build them so they're easier to implement in classrooms? Those types of considerations. I don't want to convey that in any way, shape, or form, EdReady is necessarily the ideal destination. You all already have LMSs and learning tools and all kinds of other things that you may use for a whole variety of reasons. And I think the whole point of OER is that they should be able to kind of fall into place in any of these systems. Again, with a little bit of investment, a little bit of modification, that's the goal, right? Feel free to interrupt me at any time, by the way, if you have questions. So I wasn't actually planning to use a lot of slides, and then as I sort of saw what people were talking about, I'm like, I'm going to have to use some slides. So just to give you a little bit of a dive into some of the ways that we think about some of the work you all are doing. EdReady, for example, and this is actually course material that we publish as OER. It's a multimedia-rich course for developmental math. It's the entirety of high school math, basically. But the most important thing about it is that it's natively built with a very modular structure. So why? Well, we talk about modularity as kind of imagine of them as being like Lego blocks. And you're not necessarily going to transform Legos into something that is not a Lego or a differently shaped Lego. That's not the level of modification we're trying to support, but you certainly will mix and match Legos to build interesting new things. So you can take the same pile of Lego blocks and create a very blocky looking dog or a small house or a very colorful fire engine, whatever, right? But the blocks, you're not changing the blocks. You're using their inherent capability to be mixed and matched. That's what we've built. When you think about the OER you're going to develop, that's one way to think about it, right? That you can think about it as being a piece of something that you would combine with other pieces to create learning experiences that together become something more holistic, more synergistic, right? Another way to think about it is, oh, no, actually the unit that we've built, I'm expecting people to go in and monkey around with it and change it, like change the writing, change the pictures I use, change the examples. What I would say is there's probably some happy in-between space. And that's going to be the challenge in the construction. And I speak to that because we have now at least 15 years of OER kind of stuff going on. And what we don't see is a whole lot of the sort of final part of the OER lifecycle, which is the adaptation, remix, and republish side. And I think part of that is because we haven't done a good job as a community when we build OER defining what makes this an effective learning object. So if I hand it to you and I say, I believe this is an effective learning object, you say, I love it, I want to change it, The question is, what can you change without breaking what was inherent in the design that led to you believing that you get good learning outcomes? Without that sort of, we like to call them guardrails, right? You know, something that's sort of like, no, if you just kick that whole part out, you've kind of just ruined it. Yeah. Or as opposed to making minor modifications where you probably haven't really done anything much at all, which may be fine. So there's some in-between space, and that's I think over the course of the next couple days, that's some of what you'll be grappling with. It's just how modifiable am I imagining these objects that you're all going to co-create? Do you want them to be? In our case, we're like, well, we don't expect people to go in and really change videos, for example. They're not super modifiable. It's a hard thing to do. But text, sure. Text and the surrounding text, that's easy to change. And so we created all these modules. And then there are a variety of ways you can define them. This is kind of a typical mathy way. There's arithmetic and algebra and so on. You could also decompose them further. So these are all the modules, again, the units, if you will, and they're composed of lessons, and each of the lessons is then divided into a whole bunch of topics. And so now we're starting to get into smaller Legos that you can mix and match and recombine in various ways. And then you could also just come up with your arbitrary combinations. So there's a very simple system in EdReady for taking a whole list of, let's say, topics and deciding what's in and out, snapping them together, just like Legos, to make a new object. And when you do that, you create what we call pathways or study paths. So in the parlance of what you all are doing, you could imagine something like, well, I'm teaching biomechanics, structure, and function. I'm going to use that example a few times. In order to teach that in a more quantitative way, my students are going to have to grapple with these math concepts. That's something you can define ahead of time. And because I don't want to waste time having them review all the math under the sun, I'm going to identify that ahead of time. And now what I need is either to teach them or review that stuff, or maybe I can use a program like EdReady to do it for me, save myself some time and effort. And that's exactly what people do. In addition to defining the scope, that's what we call the scope and sequence, a program like EdReady allows you to use and assign various OER collections. It's all been pre-aligned, so all you're really doing is deciding, do I like PhET-Sims or Khan Academy or whatever or not? And similarly on the assessment side, there's a whole set of collections of assessment items which get at the same concepts in different ways. So we imagine this exercise, someone kind of goes through all this work and makes a decision about, all right, I plan to do this in my class. It's a biology class, so I can't spend a huge amount of time on math, but I can pre-configure a program like EdReady to support the math skills they need to be successful and just assign it as an assignment that they might take. I go through all that, again, just to start to give you a handle on, we as a group, so it's part of the group that was meeting prior to this, when we talked about all the different sort of things that stand in the way of more quantitative instruction in biology classes, well, certainly some of it is a lack of exemplary, quantitatively rigorous learning material. That's part of it. It's a production side problem. And that's what you all are here to tackle, right? You're actually going to build stuff. You're going to adapt stuff. You're going to produce like a pool of this great material that's going to take these quantitative approaches. But once it's built, there's a whole nother set of barriers that follow. How do you actually get people to find it? That's a barrier. How do people, once they find it, know how to use it in their classroom? Yet another barrier. Once it's in the classroom, how do you model or monitor whether it's doing what you need? Is it actually making it so students can grapple more complicated concepts more efficiently, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the many possible ways we can start to get at those ideas is to start thinking about implementation models. Using technology as one possible solution. There are many others. But I'm willing to bet, and this is a lot of what I'm certainly, I think, around to help, maybe help people think through, that fundamentally the same kind of attributes are going to need to be applied to these modules you build, the way we publish them, the way we track them, the way people find and discover them, regardless of all of those other situations. So the question came up this morning about things like version control. Yes, there's a way to do that I think is relatively simplistic and will help. It's not going to be the perfect solution, but it'll work, right? What about adhering to some kind of ontology or standard when it comes to describing these resources? Yeah, there's a way to do that, right? So we'll help with that part of the puzzle. And then once we get to the point of talking about implementation, like how do we use these things? How do we get other people who maybe aren't as enthusiastic about this as we are to use these things? That's where a lot of this stuff will come back in. So consider this a bit of a preview of what's to come in terms of some of the decisions you're going to make. All right, and so I just wanted to zero in so you can get a little more of a tangible sense of how this works and show you some of the stuff that's already been done. So you've heard about the matrix. I welcomed you to the matrix. This is the matrix. This is the work product that came out of a lot of the planning meetings. And what you're seeing here is a very large Google spreadsheet. And there's a number of ways to get at it. But fundamentally, all this is doing is trying to organize biology, math, learning resources that are relevant to, sort of intersect at those two things, and then underlying math expectations in space. So to give you an example, this bio module here is actually based on one of the many potential starting points you might all use for quantitative biology module, learning modules, and that comes out of some of Lou and Suzanne's old work. And so there's some module that's called Cell Division and Rates of Population Growth. We took a look at it, more importantly, the math experts in our group took a look at it and said, well, in order to really grapple with this module, they should be comfortable with these math concepts, right? Like these are going to be a barrier to them really being able to do the module as it's currently described. And then the question became, well, is there a way we could give students a leg up on evaluating how well they understand that stuff? Are they ready to grapple with this or not? And just again, mostly because I think I was involved, we said, well, EdReady's ready to go. Why don't we see if EdReady has material? And it turned out for some of it, geometric equation sequences, nope, that material's not really there. And so that's some work that remains to be done. If we were going to flesh this out, we would want to look at other collections, other available materials out there to fill it in. But for the stuff that is there, oh yeah, we have some modules. We've worked it up. We have some OpenStax references. Actually, oh yeah, it just wasn't copied over. So we have the actual modules available. We're sort of just trying to organize it all in space, right? And you can walk through, there's all these tabs down here for different biological concepts where we did the same thing. And I'll actually point out, we do have a growing collections list. These are OER collections that we trolled and looked at and that are available to pull from. All of this material is available, by the way. This link, in fact, is already in your CUBES site. So you can get to all of these things. So the thinking, again, is if we could keep building on this and try to organize, okay, we have learning material. They require math. What can we use to both provide the math that they need right here? And then for many of you, there's even another level of math that we're worried about, sort of the math before the math, which we commonly call developmental math. And that too is sort of incorporated into this thinking, right? And that you could use, to the extent you're a biologist and you're going, oh my God, how far down do I have to go just to teach this biology concept in this way? To the extent that there are solutions, right, technology tools and other ways that you can assign and delegate and take a lot of that off of your class time, then maybe that makes the adoption cycle easier. Maybe it makes it more palatable for you to actually pursue. That was one thing. I wanted to point out, and I don't know what you're going to do with this, but BioQuest is part of the pool of organizations that we support. So BioQuest has their own EdReady site, which as far as I'm concerned, any of you can just go to town on. But we can talk about how that might be useful. If people want to explore some of the ways that some of what you're developing could be supported by a system like EdReady and the BioQuest site, or if you want your own sites. Some of you have your own sites. You may not even know that, depending on your role at your institution. I wanted to show you a little bit of how this looks just so I can bring it home. So on this particular site, I can just enter as a guest. And I think, so there's a variety of things you can do on the site. You can use what we call just like a public goal, where you just open it up to everybody and you say, hey, here's all this math material that in theory I want people to know, and it could be like everything. This is a lot of material. And just say, I want students to do this as a prerequisite, sort of a way of sort of double checking their math readiness for my course in a broad sense, right? That's one way of using it, and people do that. I think a sort of more interesting opportunity exists to create much more focused goals. And you can see you can customize almost everything. And so this is an example where I used the alignment we got out of the matrix to define, well, what are the math skills that are needed for the modules we have related to the biomechanics structure and function. So just went through the exercise, right? We define the math that's needed in order to get at that learning module. It turns out it's not a lot, but it's critical. There's basically some ratios, rates, and proportions, and some geometry material. And so in at least a tool like EdReady, I just narrowed it down. I said everything else is irrelevant. If that's what I want them to prepare for, then this is all they really need to know. And there's a fairly simple process where you go in and you answer a few questions, and I'm going to pretend I don't know anything. And these questions are all subject. You can build your own questions and drop them in, and this is all stuff we can do together. But once you get to the end of that, it says, well, you don't really know this stuff. Fortunately, a tool like EdReady gives you everything you need to learn it. So with something like ratios, rates, proportions, like, hey, you don't seem to understand that. You need to understand it if we're going to tackle these biology concepts. All right, go in and fix this. And all the material's here. So this would be our own multimedia material. These are the open educational resources you can use. And it includes a lot of really nice stuff. I'm not even sure. The volume's not, oh, actually, that's probably me.
2 brands of frozen pizza has more calories per serving.
Anyway.
Is the speed limit on this road 50 miles per hour?
Explanations of what this is about, why do you need to understand this, practice and review, and more importantly, I think from our perspective, you can add other collections of material, right? So there's art of problem solving in here. I probably have some Khan Academy, et cetera, right? So these are all things you can choose to incorporate or not. If you have your own collections, we can work together to load them up. If you have other ways you wish you could assess whether they know this stuff, we can work on getting that in. It's supposed to be a platform that doesn't sort of say, here's the one, like I often say, it's not a platform that is designed ahead of time to be implemented with a certain fidelity. It really, fidelity is not an objective thing, right? Fidelity depends on the situation. Like, what is the problem you're trying to solve? What is the context in which you're doing it? Let's work together to define that and make sure it fits, right? Any questions about all this stuff? Everybody's like, ah. Yes. Yeah, so if you have your own EdReady or you get access to the back end, right, which requires some kind of permission, because this is all dealing in what's technically federally protected student data. But if you have your own EdReady site or you work with the BioQuest people to make that work, you get this incredibly rich body of reporting, as you would expect, right? It's an online learning tool, so it tracks time on task, progress. You can set up all kinds of sort of like alerts on, are they moving at the pace you want? Are they hitting the milestones that you wish they would hit when you think they should be hitting them, et cetera, et cetera. It'll give you insight onto whether they're just kind of testing themselves as a way of like getting through it, or are they actually spending time learning the material? Yeah, so that's all in there. And I should back up a little bit. So as I said, I mean, the bulk of our work as an organization really focuses on this issue of basically matriculating to post-secondary studies without ending up in developmental math or English. We also support English. And so under that model, a lot of what we do acknowledges the fact that so much of the problem and the way we typically handle that is we end up having to use sort of a one-size-fits-all solution. Like go take a whole course, like a whole semester of material to deal with the fact that you're not quite there. Your AccuPlacer score was not quite right, like whatever it might be. And in fact, we know there's huge variation in exactly where those students are deficient and what they might need. And so we have reams of evidence at this point that if you use something like EdReady, right, more of a personalized approach where you diagnose exactly where those gaps are and then target them, that for some people, it can change what would have been a whole semester into just literally a couple days or a week or two of targeted, focused work. They fill those gaps, they move on, and we do see the follow-on success you would hope for. So anyway, the system is incredibly flexible. That's part of, I think, the reason why I'm involved in this effort is because we're trying to evaluate, well, we know people use it for co-requisite support. We use it, for example, in targeted workforce development support. There's a lot of different ways, and what we're hoping is that something like this may help to guide and support implementation of the efforts of a group like this, right? You all are going to be a little bit more on the cutting edge of your willingness to, plug in some of these modules into your classes, right? Work with colleagues across the aisle, et cetera. We're kind of worried about the people who aren't in this room. Like, who are the faculty who are like, oh yeah, quantitative skills, oh my God, I don't really want to deal with that. And what we want to be able to say is, look, why don't you start with something simple? Why don't you try this module? Here's a way of making sure students have the math skills to tackle it. It'll mostly run by itself, maybe a little bit of checking in to making sure they're getting it done, and then just see what happens. And if they start to get excited about, oh my gosh, right, like I'm doing things I never thought I could, now maybe they're going to want to take that next step, do a deeper level of sort of embrace of this thinking. That's our thought, anyway. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Yeah. So this study path here, this is a very simple one because there are only the 2 units, but this is personalized to this student. So what the student sees and the progress that's made and the resources that are presented and everything depends on what that student has demonstrated mastery for. So you define the expectations for the whole class, for example, but each person's going to have an entirely unique experience depending on where they are. There is yet another level at which this all works, which is really the learning objectives that we cobble together to turn into a topic, right? A unit of instruction. The learning objectives are actually shown by these little dots. So simplifying ratios and rates is actually, write ratios and rates is fractions in simplest form, find unit rates, and find unit prices. Like those are the 3 learning objectives that together comprise that learning unit. And each of those is independently assessed and evaluated. And then the reference objects depend on, do they have mastery at that level or not? Does that make sense? So the overall mastery level, this number here, is set by you. Like, what are your expectations? Do they need to know it all? Do they need to know 80%? Yeah, whatever that might be. When you get down all the way into the individual objectives, like, no, they either have to, they need to know it, right? We're not going to accept 80% mastery of an objective. Yeah. Anyway, some other things I just wanted to quickly showcase. So I sort of have been fiddling with some of this stuff since we started this whole project. This is a Google Classroom site. And so I started playing around with, well, we have these learning modules and we have sort of ideas about how we might package them. And how would I organize that in space, right? And so I just sort of created this classroom site and started thinking about, all right, well, I mean, I could use kind of almost like a master list and have all the appropriate reference materials from there. And you could imagine in your LMS or some other system simply dropping in the links to specific subsections of a site like this and using it to organize in time and space when students are referred to something, monitoring their progress, et cetera. That might also just be way too fancy and complicated, right? But the point is that in the end, one of the great affordances of not just OER, but this sort of digital world we're in is this capacity to do things in all these different creative ways. And I think for a lot of people, that's just really overwhelming. There's sort of this sensation of, oh my gosh, what do I need to learn next? And how do, and you start to worry about spending most of your time helping students recover lost passwords than actually learning the material. And we totally agree, we get that. But I also would just encourage you to maybe try to let go a little bit of any particular preconceived ideas you have about the constraints you're operating under, right? It's like, you don't necessarily have to support, for example, in-classroom instruction with some of these new sort of opportunities by deeply integrating it into your LMS structure and whatever. Although sometimes there are benefits to doing that. So that's another piece that I'm expecting you all will start grappling when you start thinking about how do we make this easier for people to implement. Don't just sort of throw it at them and wish them luck. We can start thinking about the mechanics of all of that. Oh, right. I don't know that I have. Nope. That's really it for my what I was going to say. Any more questions? Yes. Mm-hmm. No. So you're talking about EdReady? So yeah, as far as EdReady goes, it is a cloud-based system. And so it'll support single sign-on. And then if you want to create a set of links within a course shell or something like that, you can do it. But it's really best understood as a competency-based system. And so it's not like what it does depends on how you configure it. And so there's no simple way for us to pre-configure it as a pre-installed app in D2L or Canvas or anything like that without greatly limiting what it does. Does that make sense? Because all the customization has to happen on the EdReady side. So if we sort of pre-configure all that and someone's like, oh, I want to use it, and they make a few choices on D2L, Well, mostly they would only be barely scratching the surface of what's possible because they're not realizing that there's all this other capability that we can't pre-create in D2L. Yeah, anyway. Everybody always wants the really easy answer there, and I'm like, sorry. Yeah, I mean, so we have a lot of integration with any learning management system, but there is some work involved. Other questions about any of the sort of, yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I'm glad you brought up the accessibility piece. So, accessibility is a super thorny issue in the OER world. And I agree with what Mike said earlier that, I think the community as a rule has kind of finally gotten over it and is recognizing that there's a commitment that you have to make to doing the further work if you're going to generate stuff that you're expecting people to be able to use without violating federal law. You're going to have to make it accessible. Unfortunately, in most cases, what that means is that you start to reduce the interactivity, for example. That stuff's just way harder to make accessible than just a straight text with a few images and image descriptions. As far as this goes, so we've never been able to get a grant for accessibility, so we just finally paid for it. And we are very accessible. We haven't gotten our final audit to get an external validation, but we have reached the gold standard, which is WCAG, is what they call WCAG 2.0 AA. They are now moving to 2.1, which, it's just like you're always trying to keep up, but it is fully usable by any of the screen readers, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, we actually, if you don't know them, there are some organizations that are doing a pretty good job playing across the accessibility and OER spaces. So I point you to places like Benetech, which is a really interesting organization, and we work closely with them on some new tools that we're hoping to integrate into EdReady for math learning in particular. In fact, I think you guys would love this. So, there is there's a tool they built called MathShare, and they purpose built it because when they asked mathematics educators what is missing from most online math tools that they really wish they could get, and the number one thing was, when students learn math online, there's almost never any way for them to show their work, right? How do you capture their thinking and have them actually work out step by step their logic to an answer? So they built that. They actually have a tool called MathShare, which I think is pretty slick. It allows you to create problems, and you can create problem sets, and you publish them. And then when students go there, they're given a whole palette where they actually are given a set of prompts to show each step. And they can type it, they can speak it, they can draw it, and it captures it all. And then when you submit, the teacher is alerted and can go in and review it all and comment on it. And so we're integrating that into EdReady. I think we're their first partner in that regard, and trying to make it so that the ability to assign people, right, to use MathShare in a given context is super easy, and we'll also keep all the version history. So anyway, they're a great organization. And then another one is called the Inclusive Design Research Center, IDRC, which has a specific project called the Flow Project. They're based out of Canada. And they do a lot of work on what they call universal design, and this whole idea that accessibility should not be, it's much like the problem we're tackling, right? Like, it seems silly to us, this is at least our philosophy, to talk about students who are developmental or not developmental, because that pretends there's like some line, and there isn't, right? It's a spectrum. And where you decide to draw that cutoff, whether you call it a cut score or what have you, is totally arbitrary. And what we really need to do is embrace, right, the idea that there's a spectrum. Even the people who are really well prepared probably don't know 100% of the material they need for success in their classes, right? There's still some gaps they're going to have to fill in at some point. And so all we really need to know is, well, how big is it? And it matters where they're headed, right? Yeah. It's different if you're going to become an artist versus becoming an engineer, right? I mean, anyway. So accessibility, I think, is the same, right? I mean, technically, anytime you struggle with your phone because it just seems like it wasn't very well put together, like that's kind of an accessibility problem. And you're like, oh, okay, we can make it better by thinking about the full diversity of the ways that people engage with information, engage with their, objects. So anyhow, that group is doing a lot of really interesting work to try to make that more operational, right? Actually help people think about design around that. Any other questions? All right, so I've just finished by saying that, again, I feel like my place here is mostly to be paying attention as you guys grapple with things and start to develop things and sort of help think through the mechanics of what more we might need to do to make sure that when we publish them, they're findable, they're easy to adapt, they go to the various places they need to go, and that people understand what they can do with them without breaking them. That's kind of how I'm sort of seeing my role, but I would be having, many of you are almost certainly in positions with which my organization, NROC, engages around things like rethinking the way we support developmental math and developmental English. And just in general, like how do you implement co-requisite support and blah, blah, blah. So I'll be around the rest of the time. Feel free to track me down. And thanks.